In this video, we will talk about how to plan a debate lesson. So what are the first few main steps that you have to take? What are the sort of ideas you need to consider whenever planning for a debate lesson? We will be focusing mostly on how to plan a lesson which includes actual debate. But a lot of the things that I will be talking about can also be applied in terms of planning debate-like activities. I will give you some examples of what I mean by those and how to adapt them to classroom use. But in general, what we will be focusing on today are the main steps of the planning part of teaching. And we will mainly focus on how this differs from your normal day-to-day lesson planning. Predominantly, it still remains the same. So the things that you need to consider when planning a debate lesson pretty much correspond to the things that you already have to keep in mind when planning for your everyday lessons. But there are some unique elements that you need to consider when planning a more debate-focused one. That can, once you're just starting out in this sort of debate methodology, they can seem a bit intimidating. But once you get used to them, the first steps are always the most difficult. Once you get used to them, they become sort of part of your everyday nature, and they can also be very well sped up. Okay, so let's first address why you as a teacher should use debate. I will not be speaking here for a long time. As you can see, I have only provided you with a link because within this Erasmus Plus project, we have already prepared one video specifically on this topic for you. It's a very good video walking you through debate as an active teaching method, and I highly recommend that you go through that one and then return back here to see how to plan one, or maybe you've already started there. I would just say 2 or 3 sentences here in terms of why you really should use debate methods. And this is because debate, as all active methods, really engages students and allows them to take ownership over all processes of learning, right? So debate is at least somewhat unique in the aspect of also competitive nature, which engages students much more and on a much deeper level. And because there is a lot of different elements of research going into debate, the knowledge that they will gain is much deeper, and they will retain it for longer than they would have through other traditional means. But again, for more details, I highly encourage you to watch this video prepared by my colleague Mattia. And we will now focus more on just truly the planning stages. So after you've already decided that you will use debate. I have decided to structure this video by going through some common concerns that we've heard from teachers when it comes to using debate. So the first common concern that we heard about is that planning of the lesson is somewhat more demanding than planning a normal traditional lesson that you might be used to. This is true to a point, but not as true as we would sometimes claim, which is why we've also made this video to sort of guide you through it to make things a bit easier for you. Then we will talk about selection of motions, so how to pick a topic that your students will be debating, because this is usually something teachers generally tend to struggle with at least a bit, and it's something that we can assist you with quite a lot. Then we will discuss formats of debate. I will not go into too much detail here in terms of formal formats that we use in competitive debate, because both Mattia and Mateusz have already shown you a few different formats and walked you through the rules and showed you a few different adaptations. What I will talk about here is going to be what are sort of the factors that you need to be that you need to pay most attention to when it comes to classroom use. So what are the elements that are absolutely essential that you cannot ignore if you decide to adapt the formats that Mattia and Mateusz have already talked about? Then we will touch upon strict practicalities of how a debate lesson should look like. So going from once the idea pops into your mind to the execution itself. And lastly, we will talk about cooperation, because debate as a method is one of the really good benefits of debate is that it allows a lot of teachers to work together as a unit and cover more grounds, both in terms of one subject and in terms of all other subjects combined. So we will also spend a few minutes talking about how to cooperate on both a national level, school level, subject level, and then also how to cooperate within the classroom itself. Okay, so let's begin with the bending planning. So as I already said, debate is always consists of two sides, right? So one side is for something, one side is against something. My video over here won't really give you, because we are stemming from this binary of yes and no, my video here will very rarely give you clear answers, because there are no real clear answers when it comes to things. There are no strict rules. Everything is sort of malleable. Everything is adaptable towards your needs. And there are no real binary answers of yes and no. If you ask me if it's difficult to plan a debate lesson, it is, but it's also not. Is it difficult to plan a traditional lesson? Yes, it is, but also it's not once you get used to it, right? We as teachers tend to believe that planning a debate lesson requires a lot of work on our behalf. That's true. It requires, I would claim, a bit more effort than planning a traditional lesson does, but the benefits that we reap are much higher than, especially in the classroom itself. The amount of time you put into planning of a debate lesson is going to be returned to you in the amount of time given back to you during the lesson itself. You are a lot more hands-on during the planning process, and then during the execution process, you are only there really to manage the classroom, but the teaching and learning processes are done by students themselves. So debate is hands-on when planning, but pretty much hands-off while executing. So it sort of levels these two scales. So when it comes to time and time consumption, right, it is time consuming to prepare a lesson. It is maybe a bit more time consuming to execute that lesson than it would have been through just traditional lecture or something along those lines. But it also gives back in terms of allowing you to revise much less than you would have to normally, because the retention of knowledge by students through debate is much higher than it would have been otherwise. So when it comes to time, what we usually recommend is that you dedicate more than just one school hour for debate. My general experience tells me that you should dedicate at least parts of 2 lessons before you get to a debate lesson. This is why we claim that the debate can be a bit more time consuming. During the first lesson, what you need to discuss with your students is the topic of what the debate will be about. So now here, as you can see, we're focusing on actual pro et contra debate, right? So the ultimate goal of this lesson that we're planning now together is going to be an actual physical debate, so not just a debate activity. So during this first initial period, you need to discuss the topic, so the motion and everything around it, with your students. It's a good idea to also come up with some arguments for and against already, so that the students are then less intimidated by going through the research on their own, and also a bit more willing to clash points, right? So to directly engage with the material brought up by the other team. This makes the first hour of discussing the topic worth it. It might seem counterintuitive that you would already sort of think of all the arguments that might come up in a debate, and then 2 hours later do that debate again. But this is just a natural process of revision, and you would be surprised to hear how deeper the arguments actually get from hour 1 to hour 3, right? Because the students will be doing some research on their own. I would not really advocate for dedicating classroom time for individual research. I think this can absolutely be set as homework, but I think you as a teacher should check in that the students have done the work, and that they have done the work on a level appropriate that satisfies the goals that you have set. Which is why I recommend that you also touch base in the second hour, right? So second preparation hour. This hour doesn't have to be just settled for just set apart for debate, but you can set a few minutes, ask if anyone has any questions, go around the teams, ask them about their progress. But the responsibility for argument building and for material gathering should ideally lie on the students. This, of course, depends on what's the level of students, right? So if the students are not really amongst the best, you as a teacher are, of course, encouraged to guide them, right? So give them, direct them to certain books that they need to use for resources. If we're talking about really younger students, I would even encourage maybe you putting together a booklet of information, and this is the only information that they should be using in the debate, right? So this will also promote further engagement. So you as a teacher have a bit more things to consider when it comes to how to prepare for the lesson itself. So are you going to be doing research for your students, or are you setting them free and all the internet and all the libraries in the world are at their service? This might allow them to find more material, but it also lets them be a bit more confused, more lost, and your final debate might be a bit more dispersed and not as focused as you would want it to be. But students might learn how to do their own research, right? So in every minus, there is a plus as well. So the things that you need to consider are, at the end of the day, what's your ultimate goal with this lesson? Is it to teach the content of the topic that they're debating? Then maybe prepare some information for them. Would you like them to learn how to research? Set them free, right? The process of the lesson depends entirely on what your goals are, which brings me to this point of multiple things to consider, right? I will now show you the table that I generally tend to use when planning my lessons. I'm not a philosophy teacher. I teach English, but I use debate to teach English quite a bit, right? So this is the table that I would use. We have here unit lesson, which I think is pretty clear. Fill it in with the topic that you're trying to cover. Duration. Here in Slovenia, a school hour lasts for 45 minutes. I know in some other countries it's a bit long. It might even be an hour or 55 minutes. Usually in our country, it's either 45 minutes or we have double hour of an hour and a half. In an hour and a half, you're able to do a lot more than in just 45 minutes, but with enough preparation, a debate can be executed in 45 minutes on its own. I've seen it happen before, even on a primary school level. in a foreign language classroom, 45 minutes can be enough to conduct a debate with enough preparation given before, of course. Classroom setup. This is something I usually don't include in my general lesson plans, but with debate-focused lesson plans, I always do. And it's something that we will speak about a bit more in detail about when it comes to practicalities. So let it just stay in the air for a bit longer. Supplies needed. This is something that should always be in a lesson plan. Students level. I think here, sometimes what I like to do when planning for my own classes, if I have a student who has some special requirements, right? I would usually put a note here as well so that I can think about that and avoid that. This is usually something that comes up when discussing a bit more sensitive topics, right? In English classes, and I'm assuming in philosophy classes as well, a lot of the time, the topics that we cover are pretty delicate, right? You guys need to talk about ethics, you need to talk about morals. If there are things that are happening in lives of our students, I sometimes like to make a note here, because when thinking about emotion for the topic that I want to discuss, maybe I want to keep that in mind to avoid distressing the students, right? I will when we talk about the motions themselves, I will give you a clear example where this comes into play. Then we get to main objectives. Main objectives, pretty clear. What is the general aim of your lesson? And then we get to the meat of our lesson. So activities, what you are actually doing. So the activity you're doing, how long it should take, what's your method of doing it? So are you doing things, are you lecturing? Is there a discussion? Are you going to use pair work? Are you going to use groups? Are students supposed to do some individual work? So something along these lines that you already know how to focus your teaching. And then each aim for each individual step. These might sometimes be a bit more broad, a bit less relevant towards our main objective. I don't know, sometimes some steps that you make might just be establishing a good class climate. They might be just establishing a routine, right? So things that you would normally already do. But these aims are important because they, at the end of the day, should lead us to our main objective. Notes, pretty self-explanatory. Suggested motions for this exercise. So for the lesson plan here. When I plan for a debate lesson, I like to have more motions than needed. So if I just do one debate, I always prepare for at least 5 motions. This might be overdoing it a bit, but 2 or 3 are always good, because what I sometimes like to do is I like to have my students vote for which motion they want to do. What are the benefits of this? Students feel more involved because they are able to pick what they will be talking about. They might still not care about the topic. Of course, they might not care about the topic, but it brings this level of personal engagement that if I just serve them up a topic, we might not have. And then some tips and recommendations. This is what I usually leave empty in the planning stage, but it's something that I always return to after I've conducted the lesson, after the lesson's been done, to see what happened and to do a general evaluation. I will also walk you through the evaluation of a debate lesson, so don't worry, we'll return to this step. But let's now focus on how to pick a motion. So the first thing you should always consider, and I think this is pretty self-explanatory, is the student's level. So what is their level of pre-existing knowledge? And why are you actually using debate? So are you using debate to introduce a topic? Then your motion should be a bit more broad, a bit more approachable, even with less field-specific knowledge, right? are you using debate to revise before a test? Now you can be as detailed focused as you want to be. You can assume that they already know a lot about the topic. Why? Because they should if a test is coming up, right? Students level, what I mean by this is you should never give them something that is too demanding from them. Please don't have kindergartens discuss university level philosophy. But you should also not give them something too simple, right? Give them something that is a step above them, right? So a step that they are able to make, that they should be making, but not something that is unreachable, right? So always consider being a step before them. Then there's this level of controversy, right? We tend to assume that the more controversial the topic, the more engaged students will be, the more passionate they will be about debating it. This might be true, but it also has a lot of potential to backfire, right? You should never give students a motion to discuss that you wouldn't be willing to discuss in front of them, right? Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're making them present opinions that they present arguments that they might not hold with the beliefs that they might not hold. And we all know how teenagers are. There might be some things, some personal resentments coming up. So always be careful to keep the discussion on the level of appropriateness, right? So be controversial, but only to the point of having the topic be interesting to them, right? Not to the point of the topic being offensive. I think this level between interesting and offensive is it can be blurry sometimes, but if it's blurry, then I think you might have crossed over to the offensive side, right? So I would rather here on this point, especially in a classroom, be safer than sorry. What do I mean by the topic appropriate here? Here we will now return to that student-specific scenario that I said before. We might sometimes have motions that seem interesting to us, right? But they might be dealing with something that is also relevant in our students' personal lives, and we might want to avoid. For example, one of the motions that happened at a debate tournament was that we as an individual would choose to cease existing. This is not something I would say I would give as it's an interesting topic, right? So what are the benefits of existing? What are the benefits of not existing? It's something that you as a teacher might think, oh, students could engage with this. There's a lot of things to be said. It sounds interesting. It sounds edgy. It's a bit controversial. Let's maybe talk about this. But then you might not realize that some of the students in your class might already struggle with this, right? Some of them might be experiencing some dark thoughts. So these are the things that are important that we talk about them, but a debate as a confrontational method might not be the best mechanism behind it, right? I'm not saying don't talk about it at all. I'm saying in topics that are a bit on the iffy side, I would choose a method that isn't as confrontational as debate is. But I think you know your students best, and a motion that might be inappropriate in one class could be entirely appropriate in another class. So it entirely depends on your students, whom you know best. So go with your knowledge of your students. Then let's talk about this definition of a broad motion and a narrow motion, right? If we find a motion interesting, this doesn't necessarily mean interesting and something that is topic appropriate and something that we might think the students will like. This still might mean the debate could still be bad. What do I mean by that? The motion itself might be too broad or it might be too narrow. Debate should always be happening about one thing, right? As soon as you open it up, one or maybe a few things, but it should always be clear what the topic should be about, right? If I give you an example here, at one debate competition, there was a motion that we believe that science has replaced philosophy. Now, as philosophy teachers, I'm sure that you find this topic interesting, that you can already see 20 different topics that you could be talking about in this debate. You can see that the students would maybe also find it interesting because it's, oh, is this the end of philosophy? Let's think about this, right? So there's a lot of things to be said. But consider, might there not be too many things to be said? Is there a clear line that will be happening in this debate? I think the motion here is too broad, right? You would need to narrow it down at least a bit to achieve the goals that you have for classroom use, right? Because in your class, you still have one ultimate goal that you want to achieve. A narrow motion, so a more narrow motion, so a motion that is about a strict topic that you as a debater can then broaden. So something that's a bit more, I think, a bit more appropriate for use in classroom would be, for example, that we believe that medical decisions regarding the life-threatening conditions of children should be taken by medical professionals instead of parents, right? So this motion now, you can see already with the way it's set, it's a lot more narrow than the motion of science has replaced philosophy, right? So narrowness is there, but there are a lot of great philosophical ideas behind it, right? So if an individual has not reached the level of when we assume they assume their rights, who has the right to have a voice for that child, right? So who is more qualified, who is more deserving, who is more informed of everything, right? So a discussion here goes above one specific case, right? It's never about just one example. The ideas are broad, but because you manage to focus the minds of your students in one narrow scenario, those ideas have a chance to come to fruition. So they have a chance to actually develop the complicated ideas behind it. And last but not least, the most important part, a motion should always, always, always be balanced. There should always be approximately equal amount of stuff to be said on side proposition and on side opposition, right? Side opposition should not just say no to side proposition, but they should be able to come up with their own material on their own. So the topic should be broad enough to include both sides equally, okay? Now let's talk about formats. Again, no details here. If you want details about how rules of formats go, there are videos to be checked out in this YouTube channel. The things that you need to remember, keep in mind when adapting formats is that positions and roles of students should always be randomly assigned. This is important because sometimes we as teachers might think that, oh, let's first take a poll who agrees, who disagrees, and then give them opposites so they get to practice argumentation for something that they might not agree with. And this sure is something that you can do, but sometimes, most of the time, it's best to really randomly assign students because then they really get engaged with the topic that they have. Time. What do I mean by time? Timing of speeches. So how long should speeches be? In competitive debate, they are usually from 4 to 8 minutes, sometimes 9. This is too long for classroom debate. So in a classroom debate, you usually shorten the amount of time it takes to deliver a speech. I would recommend that you absolutely set a limit of time so that you have a minimum and maximum amount of speaking time, because this allows for students to center their minds, right? If you give them if you don't limit the time, They might just babble on and eventually come to a point. If they have a limited time, they need to get to the point precisely, right? So there are benefits to limiting time. Sometimes some teachers don't limit time at all and just give, you need to deliver one argument per speech as a guideline, which there are also benefits to be found here, but I personally would recommend you limiting time of students speaking. Then we have number of speeches and speakers. Every team can have one or more speakers, and it depends entirely upon your choices, and your classroom size, how many those would be. Not all members of a team need to speak, right? So if you can have some of them plan speeches, you can have some of them develop arguments that others then deliver. You can have some of their roles only be to ask questions, but they can still be on a team. Some of them only ask questions, some of them answer questions, but they don't deliver constructive speeches, right? So this, again, you can have 10 people on a team, but only 3 speakers. It depends on what you want to achieve, right? Number of teams. Traditionally, classically, you would really have 2 teams, so 1 for and 1 against, but there are, of course, formats with 4 teams, right? So 2 for, 2 against. It depends entirely, again, on the depth of argument that you want to get out of your students and on the goals that you're trying to achieve. And now let's talk briefly also about role of students. So not just speaking students, so students who are giving speeches. I think for them, the roles are pretty clear. Sometimes in a bigger classroom size, not all students will be able to speak. So again, you can put them on teams to ask questions. You can put them on teams to answer questions. You can have one student moderate debate, call different students to the speaking podium, maybe sum up what they said after the debate. You can have students judge a debate. You can have students who are not actively debating do a plethora of different activities that still develop the same skills as speaking roles do. So role of students, even if not actively speaking, can still be pretty beneficial for them. Okay, now let's focus on strict bare bones practicality of how to set up a debate. And here I will focus on classroom setup, because this is something that we tend to completely forget about when thinking about a lesson, because we are traditionally used to our classrooms looking the way they do. I think in a debate, you should really consider how you will set up the scene for speaking, because even while preparing for the debate, so in our first level, right, when you already set the teams, when you already set students into teams, wouldn't it make sense for you to sit them in different islands, right? So have one team on one side of the classroom, other team on the other side of the classroom, so that they can speak amongst themselves and plan their cases most effectively, and not have them set in traditional rows. What I will show you after this slide, I will show you a picture how a traditional a traditional debate is staged. But during the debate itself, you also have choices to make, right? Are you going to let the benches be facing the whiteboard, or are you going to turn them so that opposing teams look at each other? This might be intimidating for beginners, right? But it can also provoke them to really get a bit more into the activity. The person who is delivering a speech should always look at the judge. So the person who is judging the debate. This might be their fellow students. It might be you as a teacher, right? So all of these sides should be considered when setting up a debate. Now, if you look at this long list of things that are absolutely necessary to consider, this is just additional things that you can have on your lesson plan. So if you remember back to the table that I showed you, that is just a table that I personally prefer to use. But here are the elements that you need to put on it, on any sort of table that you like to use, or any sort of planning mechanisms that you use. So you have to tell which class you're teaching, and what's the age or level of students, right? So what's the subject matter? What are the objectives? So what is the methodology that you're using? What are the topics that you're covering? How you will handle communication with students, right? So pair work, group work, frontal teaching, right? What's the staging? So classroom setup. So the things that you need to keep in mind to deliver a lesson, and what the students will be doing during this. And then also, are you preparing any extra material to give them? So just things to keep in mind whilst conducting a lesson. And as I've told you, this is the traditional setup of how a classroom looks like when engaged in a competitive debate. So you have a speaker in front of the whiteboard facing the judge, who is here sitting and attentively taking notes. And then you have two teams that are facing each other. They should be in view of the speaker if you are allowing them to take questions during the speeches. I would, for classroom use, recommend using questions after the speeches, because it makes it just a bit less nerve-wracking for beginner debaters. But if you decide to do it during speeches, then of course a speaker should see a person who's trying to ask questions, right? And I think this setup is also extremely beneficial for the feedback delivery, right? Because both teams are also not only facing each other, but also looking at the judge, who will tell them what went okay in debate, what could be improved, what they did well, what they still need to work on. And you as a teacher should step in here and also clarify if there was something wrong content-wise in this debate. Alrighty. Now let's briefly also address cooperation. As I already said, debate is a very fruitful field for cross-curricular instruction, right? So whenever you introduce a debate topic, it's very rare that the topic would only focus on one thing, right? Usually you can bring in a lot of different additional ideas as well. So if you want to have some cross-curricular interaction with other teachers, ask teachers of history, teachers of geography. People really like to connect during those lessons, and the debates that come out of those ones are usually very, very interesting. But now let's focus on other teachers, because I think debate can also be used to promote cooperation amongst teachers, even outside of classroom, right? Because generally, why some teachers avoid debate is because they think there is too big of a barrier of access to it, right? So if they think that we as teachers need to teach students absolutely everything about argumentation and anything along those lines before they start debating. What we tend to forget is that other subjects also exist, right? It's not all in the world doesn't just revolve around our subjects, even if we would like it to, right? Other subjects exist, and some of the goals of their subjects are also achieved through debate, right? There is of course some very in terms of formal logic ideas that you as philosophy teachers need to absolutely teach students, to have them conduct good philosophical arguments, absolutely. But students tend to already come to your classes with some basic understanding of argumentation. And why? Because argumentation is covered when planning an essay, right? So there are some overlaps. You don't need to start from zero to teach a child to debate, because they've already learned things from other teachers. And if you talk with other teachers and you make a common plan of how this process will look like, the time that you need to spend, if we return back to our first topic of discussion, so the time that you need to spend to plan a lesson is much, much less than it would be if you had to do everything on your own, or if you just didn't know what other teachers have already covered, right? So this cooperation on a school level, absolutely essential for making your lives easier at the end of the day. Now, let's focus on evaluation of a lesson. Here, I will not tell you how to judge a debate. I think Mattia already had a video or two about that, so I would very much invite you to watch those. I want to focus on how to evaluate the lesson in terms of, was the lesson productive? Did the lesson achieve what you wanted to achieve? So a bit more of a bit more bird's perspective sort of a view. So not what happened during the debate, but what happened in the lesson. Here you have a list of questions I want you to consider after every debate hour. They're pretty simple once you get into the habit of it. You can breeze through them, but consider these 7 questions. Were the aims of the lesson met? Was the process of meeting them optimal? Would you, looking back, pick something else? What did the students get from this debate that they wouldn't from a regular lesson? Did the students enjoy the process? Is the quality of knowledge they showed on a sufficient level? What went well in the lesson? What could be improved? And here, in question number 6, so what went well, what could be improved? Try thinking if the activities that may not have gone so well, is it the fault of the activity, or was there maybe something special in the group? So I don't want to say consider if you're blaming the students for failure of a lesson, but sometimes some activities might be perfect in one classroom and you do them exactly the same in a different classroom, but they just fail because the students are different as a rule, right? So consider if there is a systematic failure in the activity, or is it group specific? And then finally, do a bit of an introspection and think about what did you learn from the process, and what are some of the changes that you will make the next time you use debate as a method, because hopefully you like the method, you saw that it reaped some benefits, and you will be using it further along in your teaching career. Why do I want you to answer these 7 questions? Because it's important to evaluate every lesson, right? Even if you don't go through a checklist, you always think about the lesson after you complete it, right? I think I find these 7 questions really good to center my thoughts, and this is where we get back to my table. If I just briefly show you, this is where we get to these tips and recommendations and maybe notes. So if I during my evaluation find something that I would really specifically like to keep in mind for next time I'm doing either debate or this specific lesson plan of a debate, I will absolutely write it down over here. So over here, you should put answers. Of course, I don't need you to write an essay every time, right? But just write down some ideas and thoughts that you had during this evaluation process. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I hope this video was informative. I hope you learned some things. And if you have any further questions, feel free to scan this QR code in the upper right corner, and you will find our website, and feel free to reach out. We're always here available for help. Thank you, and good luck.